Good morning. Welcome. I'm David Rowan, founded the UK edition of Wired magazine, and I'm here with amazing panelists to talk about to what extent the Olympic brand has deteriorated. This is George Papandreou in the middle. He was Prime Minister of Greece 2009, 2011, and it's George who pretty much got the Olympics to Greece in 2004. We're going to talk a bit about the impact of that on Greece, cost a fair bit of money. Allison Wagner, super competitive swimmer. In 1996, she effectively won the 400 meters medley, but she was given silver because Michelle Smith, who was given the gold, was later found to have tampered with her sample, although the medal was not taken away. So we're going to talk to Allison a little bit about the ethics of doping. And then to my left, you don't need much introducing Caitlyn. Caitlyn Jenner, at one stage as Bruce, 1976, after the decathlon was announced as the world's greatest athlete, 8,634 points.
Perfect. World record.
That's strong.
Yeah. It was a world record, too, at the time.
So, Caitlyn, you will know from many TV appearances, best-selling book, and advocacy for transgender rights. We're going to start with where we are today with the Olympic brand. If you look at the news today, there are corruption scandals, there's politics, there's a debate this morning about whether the Russian national anthem is going to be banned as a little punishment to Russia for recent doping scandals. We have Frank Fredericks, the Namibian sprinter of the International Olympic Committee, being banned after being charged in France on corruption scandals. There's a whole bunch of these people. There's a Brazilian, Carlos Nuzman, arrested recently on corruption. It's pretty hard to pass a day or 2 days without some negative publicity hitting the Olympics. George, as the Greek in our panel, considering the ethical purity at the beginning of the Olympic dream, how bad has it got now?
There are big issues. Well, first of all, I'm glad to be here with these great athletes and both Caitlyn and Allison. The Olympics is a brand which began thousands of years ago, and I know that Thomas Bach, the head of the IOC, is making a huge effort to really clean up the shop and move forward and change the brand in a way. What I'm doing with him and in the IOC, I lobbied during the Olympic Games in Athens and before to create a foundation to bring back the basic principle of why the Olympics even existed. You know, the Olympics didn't exist just for sport. I mean, that's part of it. It was for culture, but it was basically a peace project. 3 cities that got together and said, we'll stop fighting, we will sign a truce. It was the longest peace agreement in human history, 1,100 years. So now we are lobbying to see if we can get that to happen every time there's an Olympic game. We already get this in the UN. Next week there will be a UN resolution. And I even have here a petition for people if they want to sign it, the petition.olympictruce.org, petition.olympictruce.org. Imagine, for example, in the next Olympic Games, which are in South Korea, if we can get a truce and make sure that no military exercises will take place on the Korean Peninsula. That's what the ancient idea was. So I would say, yes, the brand has problems. Let's go back to basics. Let's go back to the real values of what the Olympic Games were. Peaceful competition, love of excellence, love of the possibilities that we can have as human beings. We have 2 of them here with great performances, and really celebrate humanity by bringing peace on earth.
Do you think the IOC itself is not too cynical to take on such great optimistic values day by day when, from the outside, it looks like many of the members are on the make?
Well, I would say that a lot of the members actually do believe in these principles. And I'll also say if the Olympic Games don't take on and don't really build on these principles, yes, then the brand will suffer.
Alison, one of the big issues that keeps hitting the news is doping. It's athletes at the top of their game finding out that they're competing in unfair ways because other people are later found to have taken substances to boost their performance. Share your own experience in 1976 and how that's shaped your view today.
Yeah, so in 1996, wasn't born quite yet, but just right on there. 1996, I competed against an athlete who was later found to have been doped or to have doped. So my life, not only because of that race, but because I also competed against multiple athletes from China who were also later to be found to have been doped, was significantly impacted. And my life changed course drastically because of those instances. It was completely, in my view at the time, and this is why I'm here, unfair to clean athletes that the rules, the WADA code, the World Anti-Doping Association code, was established after I competed in the Olympic Games. And it's great. But still today, as back in '96, the rules that were in place were not enforced. They're not policed fairly and uniformly across nations. And that, to me, is unacceptable. And I feel like there needs to be an independent, from the IOC, testing authority that's not funded or policed by the IOC to be completely removed from that organization so that athletes can know that their fair participation in the games is protected. So yeah, I competed against a bunch of athletes that were doped. It really impacted my life, and I feel strongly that the younger athletes of today should not be put in that same position. And last year in Rio, I watched these athletes being put in the same position 20 years later. And I'd like to see some change, and I have some ideas about how that change could be enacted.
So back in 1996, when the gold medal winner was found to have tampered with a urine sample,
Yep.
action wasn't really taken, was it? The medal was not taken away. What do you think prevented what seems to be natural justice?
Well, that's a tricky question. I think that the Olympics is a brand. And like George, I feel strongly that the Olympic spirit is a demonstration of human performance, and it's a great brand. But there is an interest to protect that brand, and doping doesn't look good. And the brand has deteriorated because of Russia last year, and the viewership of the Rio Games was down. So I think there are multiple interests, but there's not enough protection of the things that athletes would feel most comfortable and be protected by, specifically in doping. So there's a lot of change that needs to be made.
Caitlyn, people listen to you. You have huge reach. If you were now in Lausanne addressing the Olympic bosses on how to clean up their act, how to improve the brand, what would you tell them?
We live in a different time now. And first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to this. I'm giving a presentation later on this afternoon, but although I've been through a lot in my life, I'm still very proud of those moments that I had in the Olympics. And I've been around a lot longer. My first Olympics were in 1972. I got 10th place, but I was one building over from the first time probably most of the people of the world, and especially in the United States, witnessed terrorism. Obviously came back 4 years later, was able to win. And the games in Montreal were kind of the last year of the amateur athlete, when the games were still very pure. And I liked that. I think there was a purity to the games. The Games really had, in this progression of the Olympic Games, they really had to change. They had no choice. It became such a big, so much money involved. It kind of lost its innocence in a lot of ways. And that started in 1984 when Los Angeles took it over and actually made it a profitable Olympic Games. And in fact, today in Los Angeles, there's still sports organizations that are run off the interest of the money from the 84 Games. And so I've seen this progression go through. Today, not only just the Olympics, but all of society, we're in a different world. We have this thing called the internet. You can't get away with anything anymore. And it has affected everything, politics, the Olympics. The Olympics have become so big that we just seriously have to look into this and how can we do our best to clean it up under what we live in today. And it's going to be difficult. There's no easy answer. How do you clean it up? Besides trying to get the right people in there that are ethically, very moral people. So we've got a lot of work to do. I want to see the Olympic Games thrive. I think the Olympic Games are the only place left in the world where we can bring more countries together in one place than we can bring together in the UN, okay? For peace, for competition, to show the rest of the world that, yes, we can get along. We have great diversity in the world. And that's the one place that has the potential for so much good. We have to preserve that.
How much of the problem is the value of the sponsorship that's coming in? So this brand becomes a very big money brand, and as Allison says, doesn't want to damage that revenue stream.
I think sponsorship is something we have to revisit, and there are new ways of funding. In this technology community, we find all kinds of new ways of crowdfunding and different types of funding. And also, let's think of how we use technology. Listening to Allison, but also to Caitlyn. For example, blockchain. Maybe blockchain could be a way to follow the life of a budding athlete and make sure that there's transparency, that we fight corruption. I've been fighting corruption also in many parts of the world, and certainly when I was a prime minister, even in my country. It's not an issue that's only endemic to the high-powered Olympic Games. But if we do want to, as Caitlyn was saying, really bring back that spirit, and this is, I agree with you, Caitlyn, this is really the only spot, the only thing in the world which right now creates a common culture, and we have to govern our planet now. We're not governing only our countries, but to do that, we have to have a way to communicate and have some basic values. The Olympic Games is a way to create and develop these values, as it was in the ancient times. It was basically a way to train people, not only in physical ways, but how you abide by the rule of law, how you have fair competition, how you promote excellence. And I think that, because I know Allison has this idea, and I would add to that of bringing art into the Olympics. Who are the artists of today? Well, they are the traditional artists, but the technological community is an artist community. The architects, the engineers, the computer scientists. Why don't we have an Olympiad, or expand the Olympiad to a competition in innovation, but a competition where you bring good to the world? What's good tech? And award the good tech that actually brings solutions. So I think the Olympic brand has a future where we can really build on it in our 21st century.
An Olympics of innovation. That sounds fun. Allison, transparency, George said, could transform things. We're here to be optimists, to look at solutions. What kind of solutions do you see?
I'd really like there to be an independent testing authority for doping. And the Olympic Committee has recently set up the independent testing authority. But the problem with that is that it's IOC administered and funded, and it's also not subject to WADA code compliance. So I'd really like something that's effective for athletes to be enacted and also transparent. And I'd love to see athletes more involved. As an athlete back in '96 games, I was kind of aware of there being athlete representatives, but I don't think that that's fully available to everybody in practice. So as an Olympic athlete, I would like to see current Olympic athletes taking part in saying what they'd like to see in terms of governance of the games and doping. But most importantly, because I care so much about doping, because I care so much about the Olympic brand, I think it needs to be protected. It's so special.
Yeah.
And not just the brand, but the Olympic movement. But I want to see that testing authority set up in a way that's actually effective and removed from the IOC, because I think that's the only way that it can that it can actually work.
Actually, on one thing on the doping side, honestly, I have to commend the Olympic movement. They are the only real sports organization out there that really takes doping, performance-enhancing drugs, really seriously. I mean, we have cycling and other things.
I don't know about that.
But
They
the
say
Olympic
they do.
Committee has been taking it seriously for a long time. I was tested back in the 70s, you know. Women back then had to take saliva tests because this was the years of the East Germans to make sure that they were female. And sometimes it's also the Olympics' Achilles heel. We get blamed for a lot of doping because we do take doping seriously. And you have 10,000 athletes at the games and 2 or 3 get caught, and that becomes the story of the games. And so I commend him for doing the right thing, but on the other hand, it is one of the things that really you lose popularity. People think everybody's doping. Also, on trans issues, they are so far ahead of the game of any sports organization in the world. I don't know if you know that they now have guidelines for basically gender nonconforming trans athletes to be able to compete. And as far as I know, it's the only sports organization that actually have guidelines of what your estrogen levels are, what your testosterone levels are, how long you have to be on it, is it any advantage or not advantage. We haven't had a trans athlete actually make it to the games yet. We have one trans guy that was actually on the world triathlon team, but then he didn't make the Olympic team. But these are issues that the Olympic Committee is way far ahead of the rest of the world. So I think they're trying to do the best they possibly can, you know, and they've been doing it for a long time.
But if they're taking it so seriously in Rio, why were almost half of athletes not even tested? There's so many problems that are just egregious in nature. I have a hard time believing it's being taken as seriously as it needs to be because of things like that. There's no excuse for half of the athletes not being tested. And the official excuse was that they weren't able to be located. And all these athletes had to actually appear for a race or a competition of some sort. So I think the IOC, in theory, in WADA code is amazing. But in practice, there are a lot of ways it falls apart. Tests not being performed in the way they're supposed to be performed. For example, the woman I won a silver medal to was eventually caught for tampering, but also traces of steroids in her urine. So she should have never been able to tamper a sample, because as an athlete, you're supposed to be watched. And you strip naked and show yourself. There's so many protocols that are supposed to be enacted, so you should never be able to pour whiskey into a urine sample. So while I think the theory...
She poured whiskey in?
So while in theory I think the IOC and WADA code is great, for me, I'm an action person. I want to see the action to back up the words, and then I champion it.
Well, David, you know, maybe this would be an issue for the technology community, because blockchain, maybe if you have an application where athletes that want to compete at high-level competitions, and particularly in the Olympics, would have to sort of be able to be followed and follow their own traces or their own actions, their own blood or their own urine or whatever, and have sort of a blockchain, which is basically a history of all their actions. It might work. So why not ask the technology community to to help us out on this.
If anybody here wants to launch a blockchain doping testing startup today, we've got Caitlyn, Allison, and George on the board. It's already worth 4 or 5 billion. George, I have to ask you very quickly. You brought the Olympics back to Greece. The cost at the time was estimated at about 9 billion euros, and kind of most of that had to be picked up from taxpayer revenue. It brought glory to Greece, but it also brought a few problems. On balance, was it the right thing to do?
I didn't do this alone. I mean, this was a common effort, and really a strong belief and a real desire, and I think it was one of the high points for the Greek people, and not only in Greece, but the Greek diaspora, and I think for the Olympic movement coming back home. But it didn't really cost that much. The actual running of the Olympics were about $1.5 billion, and the other things that we did, we created infrastructure for our city, we created venues, which hopefully now, we went through a crisis, but hopefully now will be used for cultural centers. Like Barcelona, we want to move Athens to open up to the sea. We're a coastal city. So if you use the Olympics well, yes, I think it can be a boon for your city. And of course, it was a great advertisement for Greece, and tourism is booming in Greece. But I would say that there are issues because for smaller countries and for poorer countries, it's much more difficult. And I think what the Olympic Committee now is looking at is more regional organization where 3 or 4 countries work together, or a whole country, not just one city. So these are things that are there. But the crisis we went through, which I had to deal with, did not have to do with the Olympics. Unluckily, it had to do with a previous government that overspent, not on the Olympics, but on many other things.
We're not blaming you for the crisis, George.
Well,
just very quickly,
I had the hot potato. But
before we go, one very quick wish list recommendation to the International Olympic Committee. If they were in the room, what would you want from them? One quick sentence. Allison.
An independent testing authority. It's not administered or funded by the IOC. We need it to be removed. And I'd also like to see athletes' participation in the games increased, and that process of governance more democratized.
Maybe a union of athletes.
A unionization of athletes, I think, would be really great.
George,
yeah.
one thing.
I would agree with Allison, and I would say, let's go back to the basics of the Olympics and see how it translates into this modern world, whether it's bringing in technology, whether it's bringing in our tech community, whether it's, they're now talking about electronic games being part of the games. Let's see how we reshape this brand and make it even more relevant for today's world, but relevant in creating a culture, which Caitlyn was talking about, of peace, cooperation, understanding, a common culture for the type of world we have to deal with, the turbulent and huge challenges we have.
Last word, Caitlyn.
Well, honestly, I agree with Allison and George. I think the Games lost it when it became so big. The Games in Munich were like $5 million for the rights, and then it went up to $25 million for the rights in Montreal. And now it's literally in the billions. It has become such a big money game.
So one recommendation.
It lost its innocence. And I think we have to get that innocence back.
Please, can we have a big thank you to Caitlyn Jenner, George Papandreou, and Allison Wagner.
Thank you.
Thank you.